See, when you're that cute, you don't have to do anything. You just get up there and stand. I think a star was born up here today, don't you? I think my favorite part was the Marilyn Monroe right here over the air vent. It does feel good. That feels real good. Hannah told me that they had to do quotes from their fathers, and I didn't have to really ask her what the quote was that she used, because I'm very aware that I say it all the time. Wait till you get older and I'll tell you. And if you've heard some of her questions, you'd know why I respond that way. Of course, I can always direct her to YouTube. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's do this, the sweetest part of the service. Second sweetest, that was the sweetest part. Okay, you guys are learning how this goes. If you are a father here today and you look in your bulletin, and if you see a Sweet Frog sticker somewhere in your bulletin, huh? The who? The Smiths? Oh, send the children to children's church? You don't want to stay here with me? What's wrong with me? I mean, I'm funny, I'm nice, and darn it, I'm good looking. You want to go to Out of the Box? Well, then go. Any of you children who want to go to Out of the Box instead of stay with me, you're dismissed at this time. If you haven't already left. Yeah, this is doing a lot for my self-esteem. You know what's bad? When a child who's normally very shy finds the courage to come up to the front in front of everyone and says, "Can we please leave?" I heard what she said. I was just in shock and denial. All right. Do I have 10 fathers with bulletins with Sweet Frogs stickers in your bulletins? If that's you, you have to get up here like Kiwi and be seen by everybody. It's worth it for Sweet Frogs. So Chuck says. Yeah. Let's see if we get 10 this time. You guys are learning how to do this with the bulletins. Hopefully some of you. Oh, I trust you guys. Unless I run out up here and I have 25 guys for 10 stickers. Look at this. Hey, we may actually get them this time. We're getting close, closer than ever. 1. All right, give these guys a hand. They're doing nothing. Cornerstone Family Church, the only place you can get some applause for doing absolutely nothing. Guys, you did a lot before you got here today. I'm assuming this must belong to somebody who is serving back there today, which is almost always the case. And we'll find that person and make sure that they get it. Father's Day, time of mixed emotions for so many people, and depending on what kind of father that you had and what has happened around that time. I was so sad this morning to find out that one of our own, Gina Mullins, that her father passed away early this morning with a heart attack very unexpectedly. And Jeff is this family. They're just servants. And when I found out about it, Jeff was back there. He actually showed up to serve. They were serving in Jam today, and he came anyway. And so we sent word back there. It's just like, "What are you doing? Get out of here!" And it's hard enough to lose your dad. I have lost a dad, but to lose one suddenly, unexpectedly, and then on Father's Day, just the worst case scenario you can imagine. So remember Gina Mullins and their family, and he's in Louisiana. I'm sure they're going to have to pack their bags quick and get down there. So be praying for them and just thinking about them. And I don't know what we can do. They're going to be far away from us, but we're going to support them in every way that we can. I want to show you a story today of a father, and I don't know how to introduce him as far as being a good father or a bad father. It depends on how you look at him. It depends on the filters that you use. He's a man that you're going to be very familiar with, but as is the case with most Bible stories, we don't really put ourselves in the stories. And I've told you guys that for 20 years here. Insert yourself into these stories. You'll begin to see the humor. You'll begin to feel the emotion. And you'll also begin to see how disturbing some of these stories can be. This is a story that you're very familiar with. But if you'll put yourself in the shoes of the son in this story, this probably won't be a cute little Bible story to you anymore. It's the story of a father named Abraham, and he was such a father more than biologically. He's also considered a father in our faith and of our faith. The story begins in Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son," sound familiar, "Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Now, if we just stop that for a second, how would you feel if God came to you and told you this? Fathers, how would you feel if God came to you in a way that you knew it was God? And he said, "I want you to go up on East River Mountain, and I want you to take your son, your only son, and I want you to sacrifice him there." If we move on, it says that early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, again, this is a precursor story to the whole work of the cross. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Now that's just low. I mean, you're getting ready to sacrifice his son, now he's got to carry his own wood. And he himself carried the fire and the knife, Abraham did, as the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Please put yourself in this story, in this child's body, in his mind. Put yourself in this situation as he speaks." "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And that word "fear" there actually is a word that would more commonly be translated as a word for love in the Old Testament with the Hebrew. And it should literally read, "Now I know that you love me, that you really love me, because you did not withhold from me your son, your only son." It's supposed to be giving us a glimpse into God's heart hundreds of years later. We know how the story concludes. There's a rustling in the brush, and there's a ram there that they use for the sacrifice. I saw something on TV in the last year, so there's been several Bible story shows on TV, and some of them have been very well made. In fact, I was surprised what a good job that NBC actually did on their version of the Bible. And I had seen one that played out this scene here, and they did such a great job. We don't know exactly how old Isaac was, but we know that the word used to translate him was the word boy. And we also know, though, that he was big enough and strong enough to carry a load of wood on his back. And so most theologians and historians agree that he probably was a teenager at this point, maybe a younger teenager, we don't know, but he was probably a teenage boy. Point being, he was old enough to try to understand what is happening here. He trusts his father. He loves his father. He has been in some situations where he probably has had to maybe ponder the type of father that he had. He was probably about 3 years old when his father sent his older brother, his half-brother Ishmael, away. Ishmael was probably about, we don't know, a teenager, but we know that Isaac was at the age of weaning, which in Hebrew custom would have been 3 years old. And so he might have been as old as 17 years old probably, because Ishmael was 14 years old when Isaac was born. And he might just barely remember, but mostly remember the stories in the camp of the day that his father, Abraham, sent away his brother and would not allow him to live with them any longer. And there is no doubt that Isaac probably was troubled with that through the years. It probably became a filter that he processed his father through because of his lack of understanding of that situation. And there was probably times that he thought, man, my dad is such a great dad. And then on the other hand, he would think about that and maybe some other areas that his father fell short, and he probably thought, I don't know, is he a great dad? Now his father said, come on, we're going on a little journey, and they take a couple servants and they start up Mount Moriah. And he's putting two and two together from what he's heard and what he sees. They're carrying the fire with them, and they've got wood, and clearly they're going to make a sacrifice. And they know that this altar can be built when they got there, but where is the lamb? When he gets up there, his father gathers stones and he builds an altar. And we quickly rush through the next part, that he bound his son and placed him on the altar. The scene that I saw last year in one of the movies was so powerful, and it was very emotional. And I felt myself become very emotional as I watched it, as this young boy began to cry, and he began to weep, and he began to question his father. Father, what are you doing? As his father holds him down and begins to bind his feet and bind his hands. Imagine if your father began to do that to you. He knows his father is a man of God, a man who hears from God. But as a child, this is not going to compute. This is not the actions of a good father. He binds his hands and his feet, and he picks him up and he puts him on the altar. And Isaac is no dummy. He knows what's about to happen. And I remember growing up with my little King James Bible when I was a kid, and about 12 different places in that Bible there would be a colored picture. The highlights, David and Goliath, or Noah and the flood. And one of those pictures was always Abraham standing over Isaac, bound on that altar with the knife up, ready to bring down and end his son's life. And even as a child, we would see these pictures of death and mayhem, and because we would run it through the filter of God, they were just okay, they were all right, we were okay with it. It didn't really disturb us, it didn't move us, we didn't become emotional, we didn't really put ourselves in those scenes. But now I'm older, and it's easier for me to put myself in somebody else's shoes. And I put myself in the shoes of Isaac and try to imagine the fear and the confusion. What is my father is about to kill me? Now I take that scene and I intentionally put that as a filter in my own life, looking back at my childhood, at many things my father did in my life that maybe not that extreme, but at the moment, very extreme for me. I thought similar things that Isaac was thinking about Abraham. My father has lost his mind. What is he doing? Because I couldn't understand. My father understood what was going on. I did not. And there were many times in my life that I questioned my dad. My dad will have been gone 8 years this July. And I miss him. And while other people sit around and talk about how they think about a parent and how they miss them, I'm not a person who does that. I have my good memories. Mostly I have his legacy living in me, and the rest of my brothers and my sister, I think they would say the same thing. He lives on through us. But for me to sit around and just think about in sad ways that he's been gone, I don't allow myself to do that. Even though I wish he were still here, because now I could really appreciate him. Isaac's in a situation where at the moment he probably doesn't think that he has a very good dad. In fact, he probably thinks he's got the worst dad on the planet. But let me tell you what happens after that scene. After that scene, Isaac begins to grow up and he becomes a man. And because it would be a cultural norm, he spent a lot of time with his father. And the moral to the story was that Isaac became the connecting link between God's promise to Abraham and the fulfillment of that promise through Isaac's son Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we all know, 3 generations. And God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to bless people that bless you, and I'm going to curse people that curse you, and the number of your offspring is going to be more numerous than the stars in the sky. It was just Abraham and his father. The promise was to Abraham. There wasn't even an Israel yet. There was not a Jewish people yet. There was just Abraham and his family. It would not be until Abraham's grandson Jacob that God would rename him Israel, and he would have 12 sons that would become the 12 tribes of Israel. It wasn't until that happened that Israel actually existed. Abraham was not a Jew, which is always important when we talk about Abraham's seed, because we understand then it was bigger than just a cultural nation. Isaac was not a Jew. The Jews did not exist yet. But Isaac became the common link between the promise of God and the reality of God. What God said is going to happen and what began to happen through Jacob, the only thing in the middle of that was Isaac. If Isaac would have dropped the ball, if Isaac would have had a failure in his faith, the whole promise of God would have stalled out. So what that tells me is that Abraham had incredible influence as a father in his son's life. Abraham, if you know much about him, especially in the pre-Isaac days, was a very imperfect man, a man who had his share of failures. There were times he should have stood up and protected his wife, and he became just a big chicken, and he backed up, and then he would even lie about situations trying to save himself and hopefully maybe his wife in the process. I don't think he fought his wife too hard when she could not have a baby. And she said, "Have you considered my handmaiden here?" My guess is since Abraham is a man and the handmaiden was much younger, he'd probably considered the handmaiden many times. What would you do if you had a beautiful young handmaiden living in your house, guys, and your wife came to you and said, "You know what? I can't really have children, but have you considered my handmaiden?" And one of those TV shows, I think it was the same one that I was just talking about, it showed Hagar, and man, she was a fox. I'm thinking they have went out of their way in this situation to try to show us the extremes of what may have been going on there. See, the reality is if Abraham would have held out, he's the father of faith, but if he'd have held out, the whole Ishmael thing never really actually had to happen. When he sent Hagar and Ishmael away, at the time he was trying to appease his wife, not God, but because God wanted peace in the home, God went along with it also. He was an imperfect man. He failed much. There was many areas that he did not measure up. And as a father, there are areas that I guarantee you Isaac would probably say he didn't measure up in these areas right here. But it appears there was an area that Abraham greatly measured up. Greatly measured up. I've thought about my dad some this week because going into Father's Day, I always think about him more, and I always think about the influence he's had in my life. And I've thought about how that while some people would look at the man in my shoes and say, oh, look at Cornerstone Family Church, what it's become, and all the good things that have happened through 20 years in hundreds of people's lives, and they would tend to look at me and go, if you'd have never planted that church, none of that would have happened. But that's not how I see it. I see myself more as the Isaac in the situation, as the connecting dot. I've had my role. But I am a man who clearly understands that if my father would not have been who my father was, I would not be who I am, and we would not be sitting in this building today. The truth is, my dad dropped the ball in many areas. You hear me brag about my dad, and you hear me just speak of him like he must have been the most awesome father on the planet. And if I tell you what I'm about to tell you, it might confuse you because you'd say, but you act like he was so awesome, and now you're telling me this. My dad fell short in many, many areas that I am intentionally trying not to fall short with my daughter. My dad was, as my mom called him, a workaholic. My dad lived to work. No human being that's ever existed on the planet loved to work more than that man. That man never had a hobby. That man was not remotely interested in recreation. Could have cared less if there was a TV until he retired, where he sat in front of TBN a lot. And if we exclude Dukes of Hazzard, there probably wasn't too many TV shows as a series that he ever actually watched. The man got up hours before anybody else. He had his time with God, and I mean rich time. And usually he was off working by the time anyone else stirred. We grew up on a farm. My dad was such a hard worker. He figured out how to keep 1,000 acres of 3 farms going and all that held, and usually holding a full-time job at the same time. My dad was a hard worker in factories and in construction. My dad, if there was an hour left in the day, and he didn't just have to have a little bit of sleep, my dad had his hands to it and he was working. And so there was good that came out of that. That's a ripple effect into his family, that we were left with this value system for hard work, and we all grew up with a strong work ethic. My little brother Robbie, he works too much. He's always working, always at work. Doesn't have a lot of time to play. He's just like our dad. We've all learned from what he did wrong to do some things better. We are better with our children, spending time with our children than what my dad was. But part of it was just that time in history. It was a time when almost all households were run by one income. It would be rare if you had a mom who worked. So dads had to do it all. And part of it was just the fact that my dad had no choice. He had to work around the clock. And part of it was that he grew up learning from his dad. Work is what there is to do. I said it in a little article on the back of the bulletin, and if you think I'm exaggerating, you're wrong. I can count on one hand the number of times my dad took me fishing, took me hunting, went out in the yard with me, and tossed a baseball. My daughter does not understand how this is possible, but I never went on vacation in my life till her and I got married. Part of it was because things were tight financially. Part of it was because you just couldn't leave a farm. But my mom, if she were here, she would testify to the fact that part of it is just because my dad wasn't interested in going anywhere. He wasn't interested. I'm trying to do some of those things better. I spend a lot of time with my daughter. I love summers. It's daddy-daughter time, And I work office hours Tuesday through Friday, but when school ends, we come in early, and I try to set up meetings, and I schedule things where I can be done by noon, because we go eat lunch, and after that, it's daddy-daughter time, except for some situations that can't be changed. Because the reality is, and I hope I'm right when I say this, you guys are always going to be here in some form. My daughter's not. I got 7 years left with her, and I'm kicking her out of the house. She's going to school somewhere, and I'm assuming probably not here. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if she pursues things that's beginning to just kind of rise up in her, then she'll have to go somewhere else to school. I know that can change. My dad dropped the ball in a lot of areas. My dad taught me how to do a whole lot of things. I've told people before, by the time we graduated high school, there wasn't hardly anything we didn't know how to build. There wasn't anything that goes on a farm that we didn't know how to do. Plant something, harvest something. Man, we knew how to butcher the livestock. We knew how to field dress the livestock. We knew how to cut up the meat. We knew how to work on the tractors. We knew how to work the tractors. We knew how to, man, we could pull a small block Chevy engine out of anything, rebuild it, blindfolded almost, and stick it back in there. We knew there wasn't a tool out there that we didn't know how to use. We understood here's how you build a house. I mean, my dad spent time with us. Don't get me wrong. My dad spent time with us. It just wasn't playing. It wasn't recreation. It wasn't hobbies. My dad fell short in many areas. Let me tell you where my dad did not fall short. My dad did not fall short in teaching us and modeling before us what it means to make God the priority of your life. It's because of my dad that now I hand down to my daughter, baby, forget what other people try to tell you about praying. Daddy's going to show you how you pray. You talk. My daughter doesn't even use the word pray. She uses the word talk. I'll say, did you talk to God tonight? Yes, Daddy, I talked to God. When she was little, we would come in here, and she was with me the other day, and I think it was on Friday, actually, and we had done some things, and I said, baby, before we take off, Daddy just needs to do something. I said, come on, you haven't done this with Daddy for a while. And when she was younger, she did it with me all the time, and she came here with me, and she held my hand, and we walked around the sanctuary up and down through here for a while Daddy talked to God. She's older now, so now I let her every once in a while say, Daddy, what did you mean when you told God that? See, she has known nothing but hearing me talk to God just like I talk to you. I do that because that's what I heard my dad do. My dad was never a formal man with God. It was very obvious to me, my dad knew God. I saw my dad's faith modeled. I saw his faith come into play in places that most people would just say it was silly. I've seen him lay hands on cows, on dogs. I'll never forget the time one of our old collies jumped actually between my dad, and my dad hopped over an old rail fence in one of the back fields, and there was a whole den of copperheads there, and he jumped right over them, and right as one of those copperheads struck at my dad's leg, that old collie was standing and stuck her head in there and took the blow right there on the side of her face. Old Doc Bailey, some of you remember, was the veterinarian here back in those days. And my dad called him and said, what do we do? And he said, well, just give her lots of buttermilk to drink. We had lots of buttermilk. And her head swole up so huge. I'll never forget the day that my dad was on his knees, and I'm standing there, and I'm thinking, this dog's going to die. And my dad grabs me and says, come on, son, we're going to pray for this dog. He believed. He believed God would do it for him. It didn't matter about prayer styles. It didn't matter about church and religion, all that. He loved God, and he was so convinced that God loved and liked him that God would do it just because it was important to my dad. I've told you guys many times through the years that when I put my hands to something and when I begin to speak to something, I never even consider anybody else's faith. If it's something that's really in my heart, if I decide to speak to the weather or whatever's going on, I honestly believe, whether it happens or not is irrelevant, I believe every time that God will back me just because God likes me and loves me. I'm only like that because I learned that from my dad. I didn't just learn to love God, I learned to let God love me. My dad fell short in many, many, many areas. But in the things that mattered, my dad got it right. I'm trying to get it all right, but I guarantee I'm not a success case. I find myself like many of you fathers, especially you young dads. We have cornered the market in world history as a people, as a culture, as a generation of fathers who spends time with their children in recreation and amusement. Never been a generation in a culture in the history of mankind where fathers, generally speaking, spend time with their children on their children's level doing things. We play the same video games. We watch the same TV shows. Hannah just assumes that every time we get in the car, it's okay just to play Radio Disney. I can tell you most of the words to every song that's on Radio Disney. I can't believe it, but I walk around all the time hearing Taylor Swift in the back of my mind. I have actually even come to a place where her last big hit, Style, has become one of my favorite songs. I'm very ashamed. And I'm embarrassed to confess sin before you today, but on the flip side, my daughter knows more 80s songs than a lot of you do that's my age. My dad dropped the ball in many areas, but in the big areas, he got it right. And I look at us today as American Christian fathers, especially the younger fathers with young children, and we are a generation that we vacation, man. We recreate. We do things with our families. For me, the closest thing to a vacation was my grandparents lived in Arkansas. We lived in Chicago. We would get in the car. We would drive to Arkansas to see my grandparents. That was the closest thing to vacation we ever got. We go to beaches last year. I took my family to 3 different beaches, and you probably wonder, well, Pastor Scott, you don't miss that much. How do you do that? Where there's a will, there's a way. We recreate, we play, we watch the same things together, we have a lot of the same interests. But if I raise my child, I just read recently a report that it's very important that parents, especially fathers, share in their children's interests, so that when they're older and they're teenagers, they will come to you and they will trust to talk to you because they suddenly believe you can relate simply because we listen to the same music. You can relate to me, so let me tell you what's going on in my life. But if we get all that right and we spend